So my name is Omar Khan. I'm a refugee advocate. For the last 4 years, I've worked with dozens of refugee families arriving in the GTA. I've sat on boards of multiple organizations that work on refugee resettlement in the GTA, worked on challenges in refugee education in Canada and in Jordan. I've worked with a number of refugee-serving organizations, including the Neighborhood Organization, the Together Project, Nevi's Language, the New Horizon Healing and Hope Coalition, Thorncliffe Collaborative for Muslim Families and Children, and Number Buddies. And I work closely with educators in schools, and specifically the Toronto District School Board, on programs for refugee children. So let's dig in. The Ontario curriculum basically assumes that by the end of grade 3, kids can read. They are reading to learn rather than learning to read. If they can't read because they have a disability, there is an assumption that it will be discovered by grade 3. This breaks down for newcomer kids with limited prior schooling. And what do I mean by limited prior schooling? Almost every refugee child I have met who arrived in Canada over the age of 7 has missed some school. Why is this? Let's just look at the Syrian context. Families fled Syria, moved to Turkey, Lebanon, or Jordan. In those countries, they have many challenges. One is money, and often kids work. And they work as young as age 8. They work for years, and then they come to Canada, having never attended school, and start in their age-appropriate grade, like grade 5. And even if your parents want you to go to school in, say, Lebanon or Jordan, it's not easy to access those education systems. They are already strained, and there is systemic discrimination against refugees. So, to help with this limited prior schooling, the Toronto District School Board has, for grade 4 onwards, the Literacy Enrichment Academic Program, LEAP. It's, and I quote, an accelerated program for students from other countries who have had limited opportunities to learn. In the TDSB, this is where many refugee children start. So the TDSB specifically says, and I quote, this program is not appropriate for students with identified special education needs, which would include dyslexia and other learning disabilities, which makes the LEAP program a catch-22. It's a program for newcomer children with limited prior schooling, but newcomer children with limited prior schooling all initially look like children with learning disabilities. There is currently no system to monitor and provide support for a newcomer child who struggles to keep up with peers. By the time the wait-and-see approach has played out, the child will have transitioned to middle school. This is not a new problem. A 2012 study of Afghan boys in Toronto found that the lack of support for children beginning Canadian schooling in late elementary school resulted in language barriers that were, in quotes, almost insurmountable. So now I'd like to tell you a story about the Hassan family, and that's not their real name. Their boys were placed in the grade 4 LEAP program after arriving as refugees from Syria via Jordan, where they'd only briefly attended school in makeshift classrooms in a refugee camp. The boys couldn't speak, read, or write in English. After a full year here, the only English words they knew were colors. A graduate student volunteer discovered that the boys still couldn't read or say the letters of the alphabet, but were expected to understand full sentence instructions in their math assignments. Although the LEAP instructor eventually confirmed that she knew the boys were at a preschool level, her response to the lack of progress was that learning a new language takes time. It took the volunteer months of advocating for the family to help the instructor and the administration at the school understand that the primary issue was not behavioral or parental neglect, but that the children had missed learning fundamentals of reading integral to their success, and they could not and would not be able to succeed unless the level of classwork was lowered to the level of their current ability. So making sure the family's needs were heard was a challenge for a volunteer who was working on a PhD in child psychology, who was very capable of working with bureaucrats and complex systems. She only got some of the supports these kids needed, but at least she got some. Now imagine a family with no volunteer supports or other newcomer supports. What's going to happen to those kids? Well, I can tell you, a bunch of them don't know how to read or write. Many probably don't have a reading disability, but some do, and they all struggle. Now, 4 years after arriving in Canada, they are suffering in high school, feeling lost, joining gangs, getting into violence. There was a stabbing and a shooting in one of the communities I work in that was connected with struggling refugee students. And by the way, I'm talking about Toronto, where there are settlement supports. Many communities in Ontario don't have extensive supports. So the bottom line is that many arrive in Canada past the age when we expect them to be able to read in their first language, but they're illiterate. Even more serious than that, many of these kids have no concept of what school is, what its demands are, and really have lost their childhood. So here are my recommendations. Teachers of English language learners with limited prior schooling need training in distinguishing between difficulties related to being an English language learner versus having a learning disability. These teachers must have specialization in teaching ESL and can't just be English teachers. But it's unfortunate, but I know ESL teachers in the TDSB who have no formal training in teaching English language learners. To this day, teachers and administrators still confuse competence in newcomer kids speaking English with an ability to read. This myth needs to die. And finally, we need specific in-school advocates for these students. You know, one might expect that the settlement workers that exist in many schools would be supporting these students, but there's no requirement to support them in this challenge. And there are no formal programs to help parents who also don't typically speak that much English support their kids' learning. Parents and students need advocates, like the dedicated volunteer I mentioned before. So here's the good news about the Hassan children. Once the LEAP class work was lowered to a preschool level, and a whole community of support was put in place by an extremely dedicated group of volunteer tutors, the boys began to learn English. Their confidence improved in leaps and bounds, they stopped crying every night, and they began to transition from being known as the problem children in class, and I kid you not, they became the teacher favorites. Were their difficulties over? You know, of course not. Once they transitioned to middle school, the persistence of their volunteer advocate was necessary to ensure their IEPs and accommodations were correct, because the language needs were, again, at the new school, completely misunderstood. So I know that struggling to access support for students with reading disabilities isn't an issue unique to newcomer families. Every parent here speaking this evening has struggled. But you have to understand that if you're a newcomer parent who speaks almost no English, and you have kids with profound reading difficulties, right now the system basically guarantees that unless there is a miracle, your children are going to fail. Thank you.
Thank you, and I really appreciate you coming to share the perspectives of people I know it would be difficult for them to be here and to participate, so I really appreciate that. I wanted to ask you, in your experience with the LEAP program and the families that you've worked with, have any of the children ever been identified as having learning disabilities? Because it almost seems like it would be impossible for them to even have an advocate who might even suggest getting assessed, and then given the kind of situation they're already years behind, that waiting for an assessment might mean that that's basically functionally impossible. So
yeah, I don't know any, and in fact the family that I'm speaking about, yeah, they were told they would be put on the list, but it's years. And so instead the volunteer and the administration just started, you know, doing practical solutions.
Okay. Do you have any questions?
How does it impact a family if their child never learns to read? How does a refugee family in particular, do you think?
It's really terrible because, you know, these families have told me that, you know, they come here escaping war, hoping for a better life, and then they see their kids like profoundly suffering in school, but they feel they can do nothing, right? Like this family that I'm talking about, they had a volunteer support, so they were able to do a little bit, right? Or quite a bit, actually. But there are families that don't have that support, and they go into the school, and sometimes, you know, they're like, oh, sorry, we can't do translation right now. Sorry, we can't talk to you, right? They don't understand the school system. Like, nothing is provided that's translated. So it's sort of like you want to fight for your kids, but you have no tools to fight for your kids.
I was just going to say, it sounds like really there is no specialized support for students who are newcomers and who may be at risk of LDs. It sounds like there's an assumption implicit in the LEAP program that these students may be English language learners, but beyond that, there's no sort of, it almost seems like it's a very one-dimensional view of these families and these students.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it, and I think if you're an English language learner with a learning disability coming into the LEAP program in the TDSV, you're in a bad situation. Like, there's almost no hope. So, and that needs to change.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to look at some of the presenters in the eye. I'm going to say thank you. Thank you, both the adults, parents, and children. Thank you all for sharing your experiences with us. Very impactful, hearing from you and hearing from the kids as well. So thanks very much. And as I said at the start of the hearing, we have provided opportunity for others to present much more shortly than the ones who presented before. And we have a number. I have a number of parents, teachers, supporters who would like to present. We'll try to get through as many as possible. I cannot guarantee that we're going to get through to everyone, but we'll try as many as possible. If we're not able to hear from you today, we have your email address. You have our information about the inquiry on our website. Do feel free to contact us, because there are other avenues to present your story if you're not able to share with us tonight. So I'm going to, and again, this is probably the time where I'm actually going to hold up the cue card. I didn't for the main presenters, but I will hold up the cue card for this time. So I'm going to start with Mary Mullen. Is Mary Mullen here?